One of the things about Romans that we seldom take adequate consideration and time to think about is Paul's narrative thought world. And what I mean by that is that Paul's ideas are not abstract ideas like the sovereignty of God, the salvation of humankind, those kinds of things. And you cannot connect the dots by saying things like justification leads to sanctification, which leads to glorification, ... That's not how Paul thinks about his theologizing. Really and truly, there are these fixed stars in his symbolic universe, like God and us and sin and grace and those kind of things. But what connects those dots is his narrative thought world. Let me give you an example. When Paul thinks about sin and guilt, he thinks about the story of Adam, and that's really clear in Romans 5:12 through 21, where he compares and contrasts Christ and the first Adam. When Paul thinks about law, he thinks about the story of Moses, of course. When Paul thinks about grace and salvation, obviously, he thinks about the story of Christ. When Paul thinks about faith, he thinks about the story of Abraham. So compare, for example, Romans 4 to Galatians 3. Both of them presenting Abraham as sort of the paradigm and paragon of faith. It is these stories out of which Paul does his theologizing and ethicizing, and into which he sort of appropriates a framework, a storied narrative framework for doing the particularistic work of applying Old Testament text and his own ideas to his converts, wherever he may be writing to. So sometimes it's in the surface of the text, sometimes it's beneath the surface of the text, sometimes it's sort of lurking in the background, sometimes it surfaces when Paul quotes an Old Testament text. But however it appears, that sort of undergirding of his theologizing and ethicizing is this narrative thought world that has to do chiefly with Adam, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and then of course the story of Christians who are to imitate the story of Jesus himself. So that's the big picture. Now, here's the thing. All of Paul's letters, with the possible exception of Ephesians, are ad hoc letters, by which I mean they are particularistic. They address specific people at a specific time in a specific situation. They're not theological textbooks or ethical textbooks. So how is Paul going to draw on his narrative thought world, deal with their particular problems, and configure this in a reasonable discourse? Well, he's going to use rhetoric. What is rhetoric? Rhetoric is the ancient art of persuasion. So what Paul is going to do is he's going to take his narrative thought world and line up a series of arguments that make his case. And lo and behold, one of the chief ways he's going to make his case is by telling stories, like the story of Adam or the story of Abraham. That's how he's going to convince an audience, which is largely pre-literate or illiterate, to reconsider the way they have viewed Jesus and the gospel. In the case of a document like Romans, Paul's most famous letter, and the first in the Pauline corpus, what he's got to do is he's got to follow a strategy that'll work. So in Romans 1 through 8, he's lining up his positive arguments for the kind of presentation of the gospel that he wants to give. But then he's going to have to give his arguments of refutation in Romans 9 through 11 against the assumptions that God has forsaken his first chosen people or reneged on his promises to his first chosen people. So we have arguments for, and then arguments again, then final applications, and then a peroration and final emotional bringing home the message to the audience so they will embrace it not just cognitively but affectively as well. Paul's narrative thought world and his use of rhetoric make what we are dealing with here so much different from a modern systematic textbook on theology. And the reason is we are post-Enlightenment people who have been dealing with the world of ideas. But for Paul, he doesn't live in a world of abstract ideas. He lives in a world of stories and applies them in a rhetorically effective manner in his letters.